A figure once stood at the edge of a place that had no discernible shape, though many claimed it was a field, while others swore it was a corridor, and still others believed it was a deep recess of the figure's own mind. The figure wondered how such claims could coexist without contradiction, and yet, there they were, reflected in the hushed murmuring of uncertain horizons. Around and within this undefined place, there existed a constant motion. Some described it as a rhythmic hum, while others perceived it as a sharp crackle of electricity. Still others claimed it was an endless echo of silent thought, while a few believed it was the soft lapping of water against a distant shore. Regardless of what it might have been, it set the backdrop for attention, a promise of motion that begged for the figure to take a first step into the unknown, or perhaps to remain still in contemplation of that very unknown. The figure had no name, no concrete identity, and yet, there were those who insisted it had many names and many forms. Some would say the figure was merely a passing thought, others contended it was the rightful heir to a vast dominion. But there was no proof of any of this, only whispers and the shift of intangible shapes that gave credence to multiple truths simultaneously. Despite the contradictory nature of these swirling possibilities, the figure felt an urgency, as though the very fabric of its surroundings demanded action. For a moment, the figure hesitated, uncertain if it were truly meant to do anything at all. Some accounts of this moment suggest the figure had already begun its journey, while others maintain this was only the prologue to a grand saga that would echo endlessly across whatever plane of existence might have been. The figure felt that the place it stood, if indeed it was standing, was both familiar and alien. Perhaps it was home. Perhaps it was a prison. Perhaps it was neither. A call seemed to emanate from every direction, or possibly from nowhere, urging the figure forward with an allure so potent that it threatened to drown all reason. It might have been a call for rescue, a call for conquest, a call for understanding, or simply the thrumming of blood in the figure's own veins. The figure almost turned away, but then an indistinct, beckoning shape materialized, or was it just an idea blossoming in the figure's mind? And the figure chose to accept the call to adventure. Or to remember an adventure once taken. Or to imagine an adventure never truly begun. This acceptance, or recollection, or conjuration of an adventure, propelled the figure beyond the boundary of comfort and into a domain where logic gave way to a fluid tapestry of changing forms. Some versions of the tale present this crossing as a literal step through a threshold, a gateway of shimmering light. Others depict it as an inner shift, like a quiet decision made in the privacy of one's own heart. Still others claim nothing happened at all, that the figure merely sank into a dream that carried it into labyrinthine illusions. Regardless, once the figure passed this threshold, if indeed it passed any threshold, there was no return to that initial state of stillness. Instead, there was movement, and it encompassed both the figure and the entire environment in which it found itself. In that movement, shapes coalesced and scattered, walls that might have been solid one moment dissolved the next into vast open expanses or swirling darkness or glistening webs. One instant, the figure was certain it was traveling on foot across a rocky plain. The next, it felt as though it swam through an ocean brimming with luminous, darting creatures that whispered ancient secrets about the nature of existence. Occasionally, another presence seemed to glide alongside the figure. In certain stories, this presence is described as a mentor, a wise being offering gentle guidance or cryptic riddles. In other interpretations, it is a rival or a shadow that mirrors the figure's movements in eerie symmetry. Yet others say it was simply a reflection or a stray thought. Regardless of the form or meaning, the presence spoke in a language that was at once incomprehensible and utterly clear, advising caution against illusions that might lure travelers astray. This presence insisted that illusions were not always falsehoods, sometimes they were truer than truth, shaping beliefs and outcomes, forging destinies from silent possibility. At times, the presence vanished, leaving the figure alone in a corridor that stretched infinitely in all directions, or perhaps leaving the figure in a desert scorched by twin suns, or maybe in a quiet room with a single window overlooking a tranquil orchard. Yet, each scene flickered so rapidly that it might have been a single place shifting forms or multiple places intersecting. The figure could not be certain, though each shift brought new challenges and new wonders. The journey continued in a rush of visions. The figure encountered a spiraling tower, or was it a sinking pit? Patrolled by unseen watchers. Some watchers might have been guardians, others might have been phantoms. Their shape was always just out of clear view, but their presence thrummed in the air. The figure was compelled to pass them, or perhaps to confront them. Some accounts suggest the figure engaged in a glorious battle, unleashing raw power that crackled like lightning, each blow scattering illusions across the gloom. Other accounts depict a gentler approach. The figure may have negotiated passage with gifts of insight or intangible fragments of emotion. Still others argue that no watchers existed at all, they were a fabrication of anxiety or guilt or ambition, and the figure's greatest adversary was itself. Regardless, the outcome was the same: the figure proceeded. The watchers, or illusions, or quiet doubts dissolved behind the figure, leaving the path open for the next stage of the journey. As the figure pressed on, the environment grew more tumultuous. It pulsed with an undercurrent of tension, as though the very air, or water, or darkness, or intangible essence, was charged with cosmic significance. Voices, or perhaps echoes, reached the figure from distant corners that might have been light years away or might have been a mere whisper's distance. They spoke of consequences. They warned of a great force stirring, or perhaps they enticed the figure with promises of unveiling hidden truths. Some described this force as an ancient entity, while others considered it a new threat born from the figure's own rising power. In any case, the figure recognized that the path forward would inevitably lead to a confrontation, a test so great and all-consuming that it threatened to shatter any illusions of safety or understanding. And yet, in the same breath, there was the sense that no threat existed at all, that the figure might have been forging a crisis simply to justify its presence in this journey. So, it marched onward, or floated, or soared, with uncertainty fueling every step. At times, the figure realized that it was not alone in this realm. There were glimpses of others, other figures equally nameless, equally shifting and indistinct, who seemed to be searching for something, or fleeing from something. Some might have reached out to the figure with urgency, attempting to establish a bond or form an alliance, while others might have loomed on the periphery, cautious, uncertain, even hostile. Perhaps these figures were illusions conjured by the figure's own mind, or maybe they were reflections of the figure from alternate realities, or perhaps they were genuine travelers on their own quests. The figure sometimes felt compelled to join forces or exchange stories with them, but every encounter was fleeting and ended in abrupt dissolution. Some variations of this account say the figure formed a troop of allies, each with their own special abilities, forging a bond so strong it defied the very realm's chaotic nature. Others say the figure traveled in solitude. And all of it might be true. The call that had drawn the figure from its original place, or state, continued to resonate, now stronger than ever, driving the figure onward, deeper into labyrinths of color, shape, and formlessness that seemed to simultaneously expand and contract. Passages contorted, sometimes transforming into wide thoroughfares, sometimes shrinking into tight coils that forced the figure to twist in ways that defied physical plausibility. The tension mounted, building into a crescendo that propelled the figure toward a central chamber, or was it a broad plateau or an empty void? Whatever it was, it promised answers and demanded sacrifices. The figure pressed forward, braced for the confrontation that legend, or guesswork, insisted was inevitable. Along the way, the figure encountered a series of trials. In one such trial, shifting illusions coalesced into a semblance of monstrous shapes that lashed out with roars, or perhaps musical notes, so powerful they threatened to scatter the figure's essence. The figure responded with cunning or force or compassion. Accounts differ. In one telling, the figure rose up in a whirlwind of radiant energy, striking the creatures down with unstoppable might. In another, the figure offered an outstretched hand, speaking words of empathy that caused the illusions to melt into shimmering pools of acceptance. In yet another, the figure was torn apart only to coalesce again, bearing fresh scars that pulsed with otherworldly light. Each telling insists that the figure grew in insight or strength, or that the figure realized it had known all along how to pass such challenges. Either way, the figure's resolve thickened, forging a path forward with increased certainty even amidst so many contradictory outcomes. Before long, the presence that sometimes guided and sometimes mirrored the figure reappeared, delivering messages that were equal parts reassurance and warning. It spoke of an ultimate riddle that waited at the heart of everything, or perhaps it warned of a cataclysm that would unravel all existence if left unchecked. Some versions depict the presence as gentle, urging the figure to embrace acceptance and unity. Others see it as stern, even harsh, demanding that the figure prove its worth by demonstrating unrivaled prowess or cunning. Yet others reveal the presence as an echo of the figure's own consciousness, perhaps trying to lead the figure to self-discovery. Though the figure could not always interpret the presence's meaning, it sensed an impending convergence, a point where all illusions, truths, illusions that were truths, and truths that were illusions would crash together in a single pivotal moment. And then came the threshold of the ultimate confrontation, which many claim is the pinnacle of the figure's journey. The environment, be it a colossal chamber, an empty cosmic void, or a hidden chamber in the mind, settled into a tension so thick it could almost be tasted. Strange lights, some insisted they were fires, others insisted they were swirling fractals, and still others maintained they were pure darkness shaped into brightness, flickered across the figure's vision, revealing the arrival of something. Some accounts say it was an adversary, a force that had haunted the figure from the very start, the embodiment of all doubt and fear. Others claim it was a reflection of the figure's own soul, requiring integration, acceptance, or annihilation. Still others say it was not an adversary at all, but rather a portal or a concept or the final realization that nothing truly lay outside the figure. In any interpretation, it was the final obstacle, the figure's crisis and opportunity, the largest question mark in an entire journey made of question marks. An exchange ensued, though what form this exchange took remains hotly debated. Some describe a devastating battle of cosmic magnitude. The figure called upon swirling energies to clash with the entity, each collision rocking the realm, fracturing illusions, and warping the fabric of space and time. The encounter was so explosive that it left cracks in reality. Each blow, each wave of energy, corresponded to a personal revelation or a memory regained. With one strike, the figure recalled a lost promise. With another, it relived a moment of betrayal or heartbreak or hope, fueling the next surge of power. A flurry of motion consumed both the figure and its opponent. Light, darkness, sound, silence, all erupted into a chaos that threatened to shred the entire continuum. In that telling, the figure ultimately triumphed by striking a final blow, or by forging a bond with the entity, or by sacrificing some vital aspect of itself. Other accounts claim there was no physical confrontation at all. Instead, the figure stared into the depths of the entity and recognized it as a mirror, a parallel self or a fundamental truth. A silent communion took place, eroding the boundaries between the figure and the other presence. Perhaps the presence wept, or laughed, or simply vanished, leaving the figure changed. Some say this was a moment of exquisite harmony, in which all illusions fell away, revealing that the journey had been within the figure's own consciousness from the start. Others argue that the figure destroyed itself in that confrontation, effectively merging with the presence to become something entirely new, something beyond the duality of conflict. Of course, there are still more interpretations that maintain nothing happened at all. The figure, exhausted or disillusioned, realized that the ultimate confrontation was a ruse, that there was no need to do anything. Maybe the figure turned back the way it came, or maybe it sank into a dreamless slumber right there in the center of that shapeless place. But in the most widely recounted versions, the confrontation was the apex of everything, thunderous or silent, fierce or gentle, it encompassed the essence of the figure's entire journey. The realm seemed to tremble, some claiming it was in rapture, others suspecting it was in terror, until at last the confrontation reached a climax so profound that the entire environment flickered, as though the illusions themselves cracked under the sheer weight of possibility. The aftermath of this confrontation marks the climax of the figure's path, a moment so charged with intensity that it has become the longest and most dissected portion of every account. Some claim the climax lasted eons, a slow, inexorable unwinding of layered illusions that took entire epochs to reveal the deeper truth behind the journey. Others assert that it occurred in a single instant, a flash of understanding that left the figure renewed, changed, or utterly ruined. In any case, the swirling illusions that once made up the path began to waver, flicker, and realign themselves, responding to the outcome of the confrontation. Whatever victory or union or dissolution took place, it carried with it an irreversible sense of transformation. In those accounts where the confrontation manifested as a cosmic battle, the final moment saw the figure unleashing a power so tremendous it split the realm into fragments. One fragment glimmered with the promise of an endless horizon of discovery, another sank into itself, an implosion of darkness, or perhaps a swirl of regrets. The entity that was challenged, if it was indeed separate, shuddered under the onslaught, losing form and merging with the environment, or possibly being banished into oblivion. The figure, possibly fatigued, possibly triumphant, found itself standing in a space abruptly cleared of illusions. The watchers that once guarded hidden doorways reappeared or never existed. Descriptions here are contradictory, and either knelt in awe or stared in horror. If they were illusions, they bowed to the new mastery the figure had attained. If they were real, they recognized the figure's ascendant authority or the figure's ultimate isolation. In this scenario, the figure had fundamentally altered the realm by asserting its will or forging a greater unity, and thus had completed the main ordeal of its quest. In tales that dwell on the figure's recognition of the entity as part of itself, the climax is described as an immersion that transcends duality. The swirling illusions around them blinked out one by one, each extinguished like a candle whose flame was no longer necessary once daylight arrives. The figure discovered that in merging with the presence, it had tapped into the core of existence, becoming the entire realm, or discovering that the realm was always an aspect of the figure's own being. The watchers, if they were indeed watchers, might have melted away in acceptance. Or perhaps they took on the figure's face, a sign that everything existed as one mind. In that telling, the confrontation was an acceptance of truth rather than a test of might, and so the illusions lost their power to confuse. This is considered by some to be the apex of the figure's journey, a tranquil but overwhelming realization that swept away conflict and replaced it with a serene unity. But there are also accounts where the figure succumbed, or vanished, or chose to walk away. The watchers might have blocked the figure's progress, or the entity might have refused to yield, or the figure might have decided that continued confrontation was pointless. In such versions, the illusions remained intact, perhaps even growing stronger for having tasted the figure's presence. Some watchers might have wept in regret, while others might have exulted in their triumph. The figure may have fallen into a swirling abyss or stepped through a portal to an unknown fate. Yet even these accounts stress that something decisive happened there, something that ended the journey in a mysterious resolution, leaving the realm forever changed in intangible ways. Indeed, it might be that every outcome is both valid and false, depending on the reader's vantage. In the chaos of that ultimate moment, something like a hush fell over the environment, whether it was real or metaphorical. The swirling illusions paused, the watchers, if they existed, grew silent, and the figure experienced a stillness that encompassed either victory, enlightenment, defeat, or transcendence, or some combination of them all. Such was the climax that overshadowed everything else that had come before. In that space, the figure's sense of purpose hung suspended, as if the entire journey existed both within and beyond that one climactic heartbeat. Time passed, or maybe it did not, before the figure found itself moving again, or coalescing again. In the hush that followed the climax, the environment showed signs of resolution. Shapes that had once been fluid and chaotic stabilized, at least partially, forming an approachable path. Whether these shapes were rubble from the cosmic conflict or the newly manifested architecture of unity, they presented a route back to the origin or onward to a place of respite. The figure, changed by the confrontation, whether physically, mentally, spiritually, or in some other manner altogether, began a return. In one version, the figure limped along, body scarred from the battle, heart heavy with the weight of revelations. In another, the figure strode gracefully, haloed by a sense of peace. In a more ominous telling, the figure drifted like a specter, neither alive nor dead. Yet in each case, the figure carried something intangible, a boon, a new power, an insight, or a profound emptiness that paradoxically contained the seeds of every possibility. Though some accounts insist the figure never actually left the place, the most consistent retelling is that the figure emerged, eventually, back to the point where the journey had begun, or to a place that felt eerily like that starting point. The swirling environment of illusions, or the quiet orchard, or the cosmic corridor, or the primal darkness, reappeared in a state that was both the same and not the same. Perhaps the watchers were visible, or perhaps they remained hidden. Perhaps the presence was gone, or perhaps it had fused entirely with the figure. Some claim the figure returned victorious, champion of 1,000 battles, haloed by the gratitude of those who had awaited redemption. Others maintain the figure returned as a stranger in a land that had changed beyond recognition. Still others see the figure as the new guardian of that place, destined to watch over it until another traveler arrived. And, of course, there are those who say the figure never returned at all, that every aspect of the journey was internal or existed beyond the confines of linear time, rendering the entire concept of a return moot. Yet for most who consider this tale, there is closure in the sense that the figure found resolution. The illusions that once threatened to consume the figure have either been vanquished or integrated. The watchers no longer pose an obstacle. The central force or entity that challenged the figure's identity has been confronted, and, in the story's final breath, the figure has grown or learned or dissolved in the truth of everything. In that resolution, the realm's chaotic swirl seems quieter, calmer, content to rest after the spectacle of cosmic trials. Observers often claim the figure carried back a spark of something, an artifact, a memory, an epiphany, that now rests in the heart of this newly stable environment. Others say that spark was always there. And still others argue that the entire journey occurred in a single cyclical instant repeated endlessly, so any talk of a conclusion is illusory.